sasabihin ko.
Great. Hello, everyone. Not sure if you can hear me.
Suchin, we can hear you.
Perfect. And okay, great. The background music is also stopped. So perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. We have people trickling in to the Zoom room as well as in the room as well. But in the interest of starting a little bit after, but trying to start on time at least, we will kickstart. So, good morning to everybody from, I'm based in India, in Bangalore, and I'm Shuchi Vora. I work with the Global Resilience Partnership. And welcome to this session on measuring food systems resilience. This session has come about by way of the engagement of IDE Global with ADB, and I'm very grateful that Kazi, who's joining us as a speaker later, invited me to moderate and facilitate as well as introduce the session. So very, very pleased for this opportunity. Just to give a background, GRP hosted the Resilience Evidence Forum last year in Cape Town, where over 200 resilience evidence and measurement professionals came together to take stock of where this complex but nascent field of resilience measurement is at. And we discovered a few different things, that there are very many different ways in which resilience measurement is done, but that also depends on the different ways in which resilience is conceptualized and operationalized as well. So the definition and whether it's conceptualized as a process or an outcome is something that impacts how measurement occurs. And from that perspective, it's often driven by who's the user and who's the audience of the evidence that is created. So with that very brief introduction, we have three very different ways of measuring resilience today, food systems resilience very specifically today. And I will invite Chris Bennett from SIAT, which was Bioversity International, sorry. And Chris, if you could introduce yourself first and then get into your presentation. Chris will give us some context to food system resilience and how it is measured at the CGIAR. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen, and I hope that people can see it. So yes, I've been working on resilience for a couple of years. I think like a lot of other fellows, we started our journey by focusing on resilience or trying to understand resilience at the household level. And then I think recently we realized that when it comes to food security, the level of food security and nutrition does not simply depend on the resilience of the household per se, but also importantly, depend on the resilience of the wider context, and in particular the food system. So I think it's logically that then a lot of the institution organizations that were working on humanitarian intervention on more longer term development started to engage with that question of resilience of food system and some of the challenges that we were facing at the household emerge again at the food system, maybe at a higher scale, both in terms of complexity and in terms of challenge, which is measuring resilience of the food system is probably even more complex than it is at the household level. So I think we are all in the same boat and trying to push further the frontier of understanding that issue. And well, like I'm going to present some results or some reflection related to how we can assess the resilience of food system. So what do we know? What we still do not know? I was sharing a screen, but I'm not sure whether you guys can see it. Can you just confirm that you have the slide format of my? Yes, you do. Okay, so let's move to then the first. Um, so as actually as Sushi mentioned, I think there's a lot already being written or being proposed on resilience. Obviously, a lot of definition. When I work on resilience, I try to propose a very short and very simple definition of resilience, which would be in simple terms talking about. Do you guys see? Maybe I should move this up. Resilience is basically the ability of a system or part of that system to respond appropriately to adverse events, and by appropriately we mean without creating longer term negative consequences. Now, before we start diving into this, I think it's important to actually start with some key principles. The first of which is that if resilience is that ability to respond appropriately to adverse events, what we also learn from household and from food system resilience is that that resilience is in fact resulting from a combination of different capacities, absorptive capacities that will be helping people to buffer the effect of shocks, adaptive capacities which will helping those household or the food system to adapt to on change in the face of those different shocks, and transformative capacities which would help again the actors to actually change the whole system. The second key principle would be that the long-term result of those processes uh, depend on actually how people behave. So too often it's assumed that the final outcomes depend essentially on the severity of the shock. But in fact, empirical evidence suggests that probably more importantly than the severity of the shock is how people on the type of strategy that people put in place when they are exposed to those shocks. So in particular, we are now um, able to distinguish between the good type of response against the bad strategies, in particular detrimental coping strategy or maladaptation are part of the response that will be qualified as bad response. Now, building on those two first principles is the third one, which is basically intervention that claim that they build the resilience of a market or a food system or a community. In fact, we have to put activities that try to increase the capacities and the propensity of the different actors to adapt, or sorry, to adopt the positive responses and reduce their propensity to engage in those negative coping strategies. And then maybe something which is not necessarily a key principle, but is very important when we try to measure it. There's no resilience without shock. So too many or too often in the literature, we see reports or papers that claim to talk about resilience where they're not even measuring the shock. So you cannot have a resilience without a shock. Now, building on that, what I want to do is to use two case studies. One, which is the impact of a global shock, which was the COVID, the pandemic, and see how that affected actually the resilience for the food system in general on the actor. And the second case study is a more local one, where we look at how armed conflict also impact local food system, and in both cases, how resilience lands can learn or can teach us or learn us some lessons. So let's start with the first of those two case studies, which was in an analysis commissioned by the sg-afnr, where we look at more than 300 documents published in English, Spanish, French, or Portuguese to really maximize as much possible the scope of the analysis. And we had actually documents from 62 countries. So I'm not going to present obviously everything, but this particular slide shows the main issues that were documented across those 62 countries. And what you see is that in addition to the effect that were documented affecting the consumers and the producers, there was about one third of the document that actually reported effect of the global pandemic on the different actors of the food system itself, disruption of business, of course, but even closure of or forced closure of those business, loss of connectivities, disruption in their input supply, and reduction in their client and consumer. One of the key findings of this was something that obviously now we know very well, which is that the COVID has led to a massive, substantial degradation in the food security at the global level. But that degradation in food security was not due to the collapse of the food system, as some had initially feared, but rather to a slowdown of the general global economy of the world. So in other terms, as I was saying, the food system itself has resisted. Now, what was interesting to see is the different interpretation of that observation. So almost in a tautological way, some people were saying, well, the system has resisted because the actors of the system were resilient. I personally think that the more realistic explanation is the fact that the different actors or some of the different actors of the food system had been identified by the different governments as being essential services and were actually protected. So in the contrast with a lot of the different activities in economies, they were allowed to continue functioning, which is why, in fact, we didn't see a major global collapse on some famine as again some had initially forecast. So the system resisted, but it doesn't mean that everybody was actually doing very well. And in fact, as we now know very well, so there was a huge number of people who actually suffered very much. So the losers in that resilience of the food system has been essentially the small scale operators, the informal operators that had not or were not usually in the radar of the government and had not received any support from social protection. And the winners, I think, at the global level have been the large local grocery store and the supermarket. So what does it mean from a resilience perspective? Well, I think that was the first time that we really, or a large number of documents, try to understand better food system resilience. And what it shows that we had still a very poor understanding and knowledge about what is the resilience of the system. Part of the reason for that poor or important gap in our knowledge is the fact that often in those documents, actually the term resilience is used in a more rhetorical way without actually doing proper analysis of the resilience. Too often as well, maybe from an academic perspective, we were using very technical or very complicated modelizations which don't necessarily are well grounded on in the field. So where to start when we pretend that we try to list or to measure food system resilience? Well, actually, as I was initially saying, uh, one of the key information that we need to understand is actually the nature and the scale of the different vulnerability that affect the different actors. So those vulnerability can be technical, for instance, those that deal with perishable food items are technically probably more exposed to any type of disruption in the system than those who don't deal directly with those perishable. But the vulnerability can be also social. Some groups of actors in the food system are systematically marginalized or excluded from the decision-making process, which makes them more vulnerable or more exposed to any type of shocks. The second thing that we need to do is, in response to one of the key principles I was explaining in my first slide, is the fact that if we do not document the type of response and the type of strategy that the different actors and the different group of actors put in place, we're not in a position to better understand the resilience of those actors and the resilience of the system. As part of that effort to measure resilience, we also need to better understand the factors, and in particular the capacities and the resilience capacities that the different actors use to try to face or to respond to those different shocks. And then the last point I will make for the first of those two case studies is the fact that we realize, in particular with the case of COVID, that having a resilient system does not mean that, as I was saying earlier, all the actors in that region are actually doing very well. And the question is that maybe we build the resilience of the system at the expense of the well-being of these actors. So now let's move to the second case study, which was more looking at the impact of armed conflict on local food systems. So very quickly, a background, that's ongoing work that we're doing with French Research Institute, the CIAT, my own institution on the World Food Program. The objective was based on the current situation in Burkina Faso, in particular in one of the provinces in the northeast part of Burkina Faso, trying to understand or the resilience of the local food system when they were affected by conflict. So a bit of the context you see on the left-hand side, the very rapid degradation in the security of the countries with the number of violent events that have taken place between 2019 and 2022. And then on the right-hand side, you see the sort of consequence of those insecurity with the very high level of food insecurity that actually match geographically the part of the countries where that insecurity is taking place. Now, what we did for that part of the analysis, we started by trying to understand who amongst the local food system, which group of actors were the most exposed and the most affected by those harm, those violent events. And what we saw that actually all the different actors, and I will detail that, all different group of actors have been affected by those armed attacks, but the transporters were the most exposed. And that makes sense because actually a lot of those violence are taking place in the more remote rural area of the countries, and transporters are some of the actors that have to operate in those rural areas. So what the data shows is that actually when we try to quantify the impact of those armed attacks on the different actors, we see that systematically those actors were, or the activities, the business activities of those actors were affected by obviously, more or less about half of their activities. So more concretely, let me try to use this, that will be helping. So what you see on this table is on the left-hand side, you see the different group of actors of the food system that we looked at, the producers, the processors, the transporters, and the traders. And you have the different indicators that we use to try to quantify the disruption that was implied by the armed attack. And you see on the right-hand side the difference in those indicators. And you see everything is negative because we have a massive degradation in the economic activities. And what we also see is that, again, the transporters group is the one that shows the largest change, negative change, degradation in their activities. The second type of question we tried to look at was what are the factors that could be used by those different factors to buffer the negative impact of the arm attack. And in the literature, you have essentially two types of hypotheses. Usually people assume that the better off, the people that have more assets or higher level of wealth will be able to use those assets or that wealth to buffer and protect themselves from those shocks. The second hypothesis that is often found in the literature is that people that are more connected, people that have higher level of social capital, will actually be able to use those capital, those social capital, to again buffer and reduce the negative impact of the shock. What the data show us, so we had, as you can you've seen in the previous slide, we had data, so we were able to run some econometric analysis, and all the different type of models that we use show systematically the same result. Exposure to shocks, so obviously the actors that were the more exposed to the shock were the ones that were struggling the most in terms of trying to buffer and reduce the disruption on their business. That's kind of logical. What was not expected was the fact that we didn't find that actually the better off group of actors were able to buffer more than the ones that not necessarily have more assets. So that was a bit of departing from what people assume generally. And then the third major result that, in contrary, the actors, the group of actors that were showing the high level of social capital were able to use that social capital to buffer the impact of those violent events. So what does it mean in terms of lessons from a measurement of food system resilience? The first lesson is that, as I was saying earlier, we still have a very poor understanding of which factors the different actors need to to build their resilience. So those, what we call those resilience capacities. So depending on which actor you talk about, it's possible that diversification is more important, or cooperation, or connectivity, or entrepreneurship. But because we have massively high level of specificities in the case that we see, there is not enough evidence yet to be able to draw such generalization. The second lesson is that very, very often people claim that they're measuring resilience when in fact they're only measuring resilience capacity. So social capital, degrees of diversification, level of saving, all of those are what we call resilience capacities, but they're not resilient. Resilience per se is much more difficult to measure, and I think it's very important to remain rigorous in the way we do our business. And we pretend that we measure what we measure, and again, it's important for people that they realize that sometimes what they're measuring is only the capacities and not the resilience itself. Third lesson, something that really emerged because we are now working at the system level on the fact that all the different actors in the system are connected to each other. The importance of what we call the ripple effect. The fact that the strategy that particular actors put in place to buffer or to reduce the impact of a shock for themselves might create actually additional shock or additional disruption for the other actors further in the system. So that is really a fundamental challenge that we will have to face as practitioners, is that the initial shock or initial impact of a particular shock may be amplified by the different change in the behavior of the different actors along the chain. And then last lesson from a regional perspective, too often, again, people only focus on the final indicators of resilience, which is measured in terms of food and nutritional security. But we have to realize that actually the disruption of the food system may trigger other type of bad responses, such as the use of more pesticides by some of the actors to improve or increase the life of their food items. It could be the degradation of the food quality because there is disruption in, as we said earlier, in the transport actors. It could be the spread of particular disease. Obviously, the price will generally show a higher volatility. It could be a higher level of waste, or it could be even like the emergence of discrimination policies as we saw during COVID. So I will stop here. Those of you who are obviously interested in the case study that I was mentioning, on the left-hand side, you have the report that was describing the impact of the COVID on the food system, the global food system. And on the right-hand side, you have few papers that are detailing the result of our analysis on the impact of armed conflict on local food system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chris. Lovely presentation. Before we move on to the next speaker, I thought I had one question for you, and I'm going to take my liberty as the moderator to keep asking these questions. And for the rest, please feel free to keep your questions in your pockets. We have a question answer session at the hour for most of you, at 1:30 for me. And for those of you who are attending online, please feel free to drop your questions in chat as well. Yeah, so Chris, just a quick question. I was very intrigued by your by your statement that there is no resilience without a shock, or there is no measurement of resilience without a shock, which is something that probably uh, probably comes at tension with those who talk about resilience as the ability to navigate change. And at GRP we also kind of broaden this definition where we say resilience is the ability to navigate change. And I was intrigued by your examples. If one were to argue that COVID only exposed what was not working and magnified that impact. And I just wanted your sense on that from your study. If there was any such indicators around which we were able to capture this understanding of whether the shock only magnifies what's already not working in the system, and if you have any thoughts on that.
I will just respond to the first aspect of your question. The reason I make the comment that there is no resilience analysis without shock is a sort of reaction to something we see emerging in the last few years, the same way that we saw it emerging about 15 years ago when people started measuring or trying to measure resilience at the household level. That's just a reaction to the bad science where people actually pretend that they measure resilience, where they actually don't even associate the particular type of behavior that they are measuring to a specific shock. Resilience is specific to a particular shock. If you don't associate what you observe to a flood or a drought or an economic disruption, you are not actually doing resilience analysis. That's all what I'm saying in that sense. So I'm just sort of guarding people against those reports that put resilience in their title, but when you actually start digging into the analysis, you see that they don't actually measure even the shock that they're pretending that they're looking at. That's all I would say.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for unpacking that for us. Great. All right. We shall, thank you so much, Chris. We shall move on to Qazi Jawad Hussain, who joins us from IDE and was instrumental in setting this whole um, virtual session. But for those of you who are in the room physically, thank you so much for coming. But Qazi, over to you uh, to present the Market Systems Resilience Index that's so critical to your work.
Thank you, Suchi. Hello, everyone. I'm Qazi Zawad Hussain. I'm the Climate Resilience and Agriculture Manager of IDE. I lead IDE's work on climate, environment, and energy portfolio. So I am based out of Bangladesh, and that's where I'm speaking from. IDE is a global international NGO. We are operating in about 14 countries now across 3 continents. And the lessons and the tool that I'm going to talk to you about is developed in my country, Bangladesh, back in 2018. And over the years, our global operations across the world have adopted the tool to measure the systemic resilience of different kinds of market systems we are working on. And we can able to track the progress of the change we are making, and we can also see what interventions are working and what interventions are not working to measure the food system's resilience and try to adapt and improve our work in that way. So my today's presentation is about transforming food systems resilience with the evidence from Market Systems Resilience Index, in short for MSRI. This tool, as I was talking to you about, was developed in-house within IDE. And ever since we have developed in between 2018 to 2019 on different iterative version. And then we have now scaled it up throughout our operation. So in first part of my presentation, I'm going to talk to you about what the framework is about, how we measure it. And then I'm going to talk to you about how we are use those kinds of resilience measurement data to improve our programming, and also what we have been also doing to learn the lessons from those kinds of changes and fractures and markers, So that what Chris have said, like, there are lots of like, the data gap is about like, and how we can ensure that the resilience measurement does not become theoretical. So this one, I think on that particular line is somewhere have tried to make sure that like, there is a way to make it more adaptable and like, applicable to improve our programming. So the entire presentation would be based out of food systems of like, data that we have found over the years, but we have adapted that for even coastal livelihoods like fisheries market systems and also for sanitation market systems as well. And there are some very interesting evidence for those sort of data sets as well. But not going to that, for today, it's all about Asia and Asia Pacific food systems, like, how we can use the resilience measurement data to improve the food security of our continent. So, about IDE. So we are an international NGO and we work on market systems development for more than 40 years. So over the years, our organization have learned that like, it's important to like, not only understand the quantitative context of different kinds of like, measurement, but also adapt the qualitative nuances that as well. So in that line, MSRI have been evolved as a tool that can not only give us quantitative data about food systems resilience, but also qualitative data to and then like, to understand a holistic picture of the food market systems. So what do we mean by food market systems? So in IDE, by food market systems, we understand it's the sum of all kinds of activities from like, land preparation in production, then processing, transportation, selling, and even to the food preparation. So this entire value chain of sum of activities, we think can be like, measured by assessing the measure, like, actors that are working on those different subsectors. And through this tool, we have been able to do that. So you can see in the left that like, how we work on, we call it resilient market ecosystems creation. So in this 7-step journey, we first assess like, the resilience of a market systems through the market systems resilience index. And based on those kinds of like, evidences, we find out who are the different kinds of actors and who have the highest amount of like, importance in terms of building their resilience. And once we have given them that like, access to different kinds of physical financial means to acquire product and services, and also like, make sure that like, the end product from those like, rural market systems can fetch like, good amount of value into the like, global and also like in a national market, but also ensure there are like a steady form of food supply to those local areas. So in that way of like, managing those kinds of like market systems in a way that like, it provides healthy, nutritious food into the rural areas, but also to and at an affordable price to the like, the urban markets of Asia, what we have been able to provide the end users, the training and know-how how to introduce new climate resilient practices and products that can help them build resilience against different kinds of climatic and non-climatic shocks. Um, and even this particular like, data collection and also implementation of activities afterwards happened during COVID as well. And we have used those data to like, pivot our programmings to ensure that like, what to do on that situation. And not only that, in Bangladesh, about 1 year ago, there was a huge flood happened in northeastern districts of Sylhet. And we have used those data to understand where we can like, have the highest amount of like, impact while working, and we have done our programming likewise. And that's why like, once we have collected the data earlier this year, we have seen like, good amount of improvements in a much rapid scale for those kinds of like, stress and shocks that happen. So we have seen like, first-hand account of what like, understanding the resilience measurement, how can have a food systems resilience to ability to mitigate, adapt, and recover from different kinds of shocks and stress in a manner that reduce the vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. um, Now that we have understood that what we have are doing with the data, let's understand what is this particular framework is about. So market systems resilience index measures a market's ability to react, withstand, and change in response to different kinds of shocks and stresses. So understanding different kinds of needs and vulnerabilities that households and different kinds of market actors, such as producer groups, input sellers, but also output buyers, and retailers, like this entire value chain, it helps us to work with all of these different parts of the systems across rural and urban areas to what they should do to overcome and help them identify the channels through which they can make effective interventions to develop their current socioeconomic and different other resilience indicators. Um, as you have all know that there are different a lot of frameworks for household resilience measurement, and there are only very few um, like framework that can understand where the household and markets integration are. So market is an important force for rural food systems because they provide the essential services so that when such kinds of shocks happen, those rural farmers can have the ability to acquire seeds and other kinds of provision to restart their food production, which is essential for short term food security of the area, but also near long term national food security indicators as well. So these MSRI data, what we try to do in our framework to ensure that we collect data from households to understand their level of resilience, but also different market actors of different levels of value chain to understand their resilience as well. So compactly, those integrated data give us the market systems resilience indexes, data sets, and that's why we can be able to understand after a shock and stress and without a shock and stress what happens to a market system, and that helps us navigate our work better than we used to before 2020. Next up is to give you a bit more about the framework. uh, Sorry. Let me reshare it again. I think just had a minor glitch. Okay. So as I was telling you about how we try to like you know how the MSRI principles and determinants are, that is helps us measure these kinds of data. First of all, there are five essential principles, that is structure of a market, and then connectivity, support, and environment, and financial systems. And each of these principles are broken down into about 11 determinants. For example, redundancy is whether there are surplus of market actors performing the same functions in a market systems. Or if I go to connectivity, you can see the how participation of women and other systematically excluded groups, whether their voice and their representation are in the market. And so these indicators helps us understand the data and different types of people who are interacting in those market systems. So overall, these data sets give us the MSRI process. So the framework is just the guiding tool. The process is where we have been able to use this framework to collect, interpret, and use the data. So it starts with first we introduce MSRI in our programs, and then in second step we try to adapt MSRI to the specific program's context. So that means local language and building out the local example for different options that we have. And then the data collection process happens. So in each and every data collection round, we have more than 1,000 data points for each of the market subset and as well as the household groups. And the fourth round, the fourth process, what we do, we also like conduct thorough data analysis with rigorous statistical softwares like R, which is already been published and like, peer reviewed. So the process is like, very rigorous, and that's the highest of the industry standard that we can like ensure at this moment. And after we conduct those thorough data analysis, we work with the country teams and programs team to interpret the data. So, the data, whether the data says what their active participation with our communities and with our market clients is like, verified. And after that verification process go, we together interpret what we can do to ensure that those indicators, let's say connectivity, if it's lower, what can we do for that particular like, market systems for that particular area to improve the situation over a specific time period of time. So understanding those kinds of ABC interventions and try to do all those interventions, and then when we come back onto like, next year to do the similar kinds of data collection, we see like, whether there are any kinds of progressive difference between each round of data collection. And that's how we use our adaptive management like, principles and lesson learning tools to improve the like, the work we are doing. So each round of snapshot helps us build out more data set, and it also helps us like, guide our programming as best as we can. So moving on to the like, how this particular like, data collection process happens. So in the food systems, there are in output markets, there are retailers and there are input suppliers, and there are, households. So all these interactions on a systematic and also, in a synchronized fashion make sure that the food security of that particular locality and that particular country happens. So we have data collection sets of questions for each of these people. And there are also like, individuals and other kinds of like, market actors that, have some bearing, but might not have as important as many other, let's say, exporters. So export market might be important for our Cambodia's market systems, where we help export melons, but not really same for like, for, like rural mountain areas that we work on Nepal. So based on in which market systems, which kind of actors are important, we can pivot to each of those scenarios. And um, that helps us like, make this tool kind of a versatile tool to include and like, synthesize information based on the needs of that particular market systems. And based on these quantitative data responses, when we also have some qualitative data responses, what we've been able to do is to score them between 0 to 5. So if a market systems is like, score is between 2 to 3, that means it shows some elements of resilience half the time. And if it's like, the elements are like, usually and often if it's exhibited, that means it's a robust market system. So those interpretation comes between like, 4 to 5. In our experience, it's usually between 2 to 4 is the highest, like, we can see. We haven't seen any of the market systems in any of our countries that like, have such high level of like, resilience so far, which is understandable because even in Asia, with all the prosperity, there are still areas and pockets of areas that needs much more important work to build the food system's resilience. So MSRI we have used in across like, in 9 of our countries. Like, started from Bangladesh, as I was telling you, and but we have used it in Asia, in Nepal, and then in Cambodia in horticulture farmers, and in Vietnam. This year we will start for the rice farmers in Jalai and other central provinces. In Africa, we have used it in many more countries and also in Central America. Each of these market systems have very different kinds of composition. So we had to adapt the tool the way it's appropriate and contextualization for the farmers. And these wealth of data sets and also use of those data to improve our programming have been funded by generous support from many donors, including USAID, Global Affairs Canada, FCDO, government of Sweden, and many other reputed donor agencies. And so there are lots of buy-in of use of resilience data to improve the programming for different donors as well. So in Asia, the specific cases where we used MSRI is nutrition sensitive food market systems in Bangladesh. It's a project that was funded by FCDO between 2018 to 2022, and we have developed MSRI from my own country of Bangladesh, and then we pivoted it to our different operations. So in Cambodia, we used it to understand the commercial horticulture value chain development, to understand what how the export and input market that helps the melon farmers and many other horticulture products, what's the resilience of those systems based on different types of shocks in floods and export embargo and those kinds of non sometimes more not the shocks are not only just from natural disaster, it can come from global economy and many other trade related policies. So there are versatility of shocks and stresses in our study. And then we also used MSRI to understand vegetable and essential oil value chain, and as well as post-harvest technology market systems development. Food systems is the, of course, the inputs and other kinds of things are important, but it's also important that whether those food that are produced, whether we can consume that, and this appropriateness improve the food systems in such a way that waste reduction have become one of the important part of our work based on the data that we have been able to collect and use. So we are also promoting post-harvest technology to reduce the food loss and improve food systems in that way. So what is the end result of each of these surveys? So as you can see, this radar diagram, it helps us give a snapshot of what is the market systems and household systems resilience at that point, and we can break that by each of those indicators that I was talking to you about before. And we can also compare that with different year and geography. So into the left graph, you can see in 2022's market data reveals that feedback loop and diversity are lowest performing determinants. And this means the market actors have very limited ability to learn from experiences. So you can see that based on our work that we have done to improve those feedback loops, the market actors um, MSRI score have improved from 2.89 to 3.22. So that way we understand whether our work had made any kinds of difference. And this is the below one is a MSRI data over the 2 years of a particular district called Kaski in central Nepal, and where we have seen that in between 2022 to 2023, the integration and physical environment and preparedness were the lowest among the determinants. But over the years of working, we have seen 30% in decrease in the score, and then 29% increase in the physical environment that suggests that farmers have access to now large amounts of higher quality of lands. So their their ability of social stay ability to manage the land have improved over the years of working with them. So that way food systems strength and farmers incomes have both increased in that way. If we like let's say we collected the data and we said 2.3 for a particular thing, but when we go down to each of those data sets, we can see whether there are diversity in the market, or whether there are integration among different groups of market actors into the market systems processes. So when we have these sort of deep dive into data, we can surely understand whether the diversity of crops and diversity of market channels that our work, whether it has any kinds of bearing onto the how resilience that is and income of those population. So Chris was talking about bouncing back. So of different kinds of shocks and stresses, we have seen if we can do this kinds of work in a systematic way, in longer run, there are significant amount of improvement, as I've seen from these examples. So we use the data to combine it with our human-centered design processes. That means quantitative and qualitative data to understand the needs of clients and try to co-develop solutions. We also do after an process of data collection and action were taken by them, what have different actors have learned. So we can do that through our pause and reflect sessions, which we have started doing from last year. And these activities are all informed by data. So all of these MSRI data are very securely monitored. And that way we, with the right amount of consent, we have been able to use the data to year by year improve resilience bit by bit. And that's how we think that a different way of doing market systems resilience to improve the food systems food security in Asia Pacific that we have IDE have shown over the years.
Thank you so much, Kazi. This is such a wealth of data that you have, and a wealth of information also connecting both theory and practice, which is pretty amazing to see. I had a question for you before I invite Yamini. Um, I I'm often intrigued by this idea of connectivity as a part of resilience, and from, if we draw from Chris's presentation and then from yours, it feels like it is a double-edged sword, right? In terms of COVID and conflict, also ramifications of that connectivity, while connectivity also in a regular circumstance improves resilience of food systems. And I'm intrigued if if MSRI has managed to unpack this difference, if you've been able to see this nuance of double-edged swords in of connectivity as an attribute.
So yes, Suchi, we have seen connectivity as a an agent of change in rural Ethiopia. How those pastoralists who have been are in the verge of declining and kind of perishing from their ancestral ways of generating livelihoods, and how connectivity to much higher value market have been able to absorb the shocks of recent conflicts, but also drought that has been protractedly happening in Horn of Africa. But at the same time, we have been seeing that because of this better connectivity, there are different kinds of seeds and that are probably not really get tested well enough, are coming into those market systems, and without the proper supervision and agronomist oversight, we are seeing the biodiversity of of the crop diversity that's important. There are good amount of change is coming to the food systems, and it comes at a price onto the long term sustainability of that particular food landscape. So on a landscape level, I think there are some ramification of those connectivity as well. So
Thank
it's
you so much.
definitely a double-edged sword.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's actually great examples of how connectivity impacts food security, and a perfect segue actually to go and introduce Yamini, who's our next speaker. Yamini, do you still want me to share screens? I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Can you? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. And Yamini is from Forum for the Future, and I think this idea of double-edged swords requires convening, and she's going to talk about how we measure systems and systemic approaches to resilience. Systems is something we've seen all through, but systemic approaches. And Yamini, over to you. I could just
Thank you.
move into slideshow mode and let me know if you can still see the presentation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Shuchi, and it's lovely to be here. So I just to introduce myself quickly. I'm a principal at Forum for the Future. I'm based out of Mumbai, and my work here includes working with businesses on strategy and risk assessment using futures approaches, applying a systemic approach to looking at impact, and also looking at systems change diagnosis in different contexts, from food to energy systems. And I'm particularly interested in themes of climate adaptation and resilience. I'll give a small introduction to Forum and our thinking and how that also connects to resilience. So just moving to the next slide.
Just a second, let me reshare.
Sure.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you. So at Forum for the Future, we are profit. And for more than 25 years, we've been working with businesses, civil society, and other actors to really accelerate the shift towards a just and regenerative future. And we do this through applying systems change approaches, and I'll be talking about that today. Our focus areas are on three transitions. We're calling these transitions because things are changing already in these systems. And our work is to ensure that these transitions are not going in a shallow direction, but rather in a more deeper direction. So the transitions that we really focus on are, how do we think about produce, consume, and value food? How do we think about produce, consume, and value energy? And also we work on the purpose of business in society and the economy. A little bit about our core kind of values and thinking about what we hold at Forum, and that's about our vision for a just and regenerative future, which is on the next slide. Thank you. So this is really how we see the aims for what we're working towards. We are talking about a just and regenerative future, and that really, to unpack that, we're talking about where social and environmental systems both are thriving, where planetary health has been rapidly stabilized, human rights are universally respected, and there are fairer ways to create and distribute value. And there is resilience and vitality across generations and geographies. So very big picture statements, but we do work in the area of systems change, and this is the overarching vision that we are holding to. So how does all of this link with today's topic of resilience? If you just go to the next slide, this is about applying a just and regenerative approach to resilience. So we know that resilience is not, we've talked about it right now. Yes, it is partly about the ability of systems to bounce back in the face of shocks and stresses, and that's very, very important. But it is also about looking at change in the longer term. So longer term systemic transformations, and really the ability and capacity to flourish even in the face of change and uncertainty. And that really is talking about how do you thrive despite and even in the face of shocks, stresses, and other adverse conditions. So this really speaks to something that is intentionally focused on looking beyond shocks. And I'm thinking earlier to how Chris was explaining it. But here the focus is really intentionally looking at resilience analysis and stretching that concept to not just bouncing back in the face of moments of shocks and stress, but also working to intentionally pursue change towards systems transformation. And I think this concept really comes from, when the IPCC defines resilience as the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with hazardous events, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, But the definition also goes on to talk about while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning, and transformation. And I think just looking at this definition here that you see on the slide from GRP and USA, there's that similar theme of the capacity to transform in the face of change. So what does that really mean? And that's what we are talking about at Forum when we talk about systems change. How can you sort of not just bounce back, but how do you also transform and change fundamental attributes of a system? And how do you know that that's happening? And that's what links to the measurement conversation that we're having today. Just moving on, and just making the point of why do we need to take a systemic approach to resilience? I think we all already know how climate risks interact with and compound each other, and not only other types of climate risks, but they also compound and interact with other types of risks per se, such as social inequity, conflict, economic pressures. We've got examples of some of those from other speakers today. And we know that climate change and topics of adaptation and resilience relate to complex systemic themes and challenges. On the right, you'll see a diagram from the World Economic Forum, their risk report for 2024, which maps out how different types of risks interact. And we today may agree or disagree about, the density of the connection shown or the level of the risk shown and what is connected to what. But to be sure, climate change definitely compounds and cuts across many of these. And we know that complex systems have loads of interconnections. They're always changing, and there's a lot of context to be considered. We know that when change happens, or even if it's intended to happen, cause and effect aren't always linear. So any resilience response really needs to consider this and therefore take a systemic approach itself. Not to say that resilience approaches are always going to be systemic. They are obviously also going to be responsive to immediate shocks and stresses. But there is a need to think of change in a system and resilience in a system more dynamically and more expansively. And that's where the systemic approach comes in. So what does that really mean? So to unpack that a little bit, if you go to the next slide. So the question that we are really asking when thinking about if a system has become more resilient, and that's a question of resilience measurement, would go to how do we know if a system is changing and becoming more resilient? And also we could ask the question that is our work as a change actor in the system on improving climate resilience, is it effective? Is it having impact? Or how might our work as change actors contribute to improving climate resilience? So this really involves looking at, systemic approach really involves looking holistically at the impacts faced, the challenges and the vulnerabilities, looking at that very expansively and holistically, the who, the what, the how. So again, from previous speakers' presentations, they were talking about different types of social groups who might be affected, particularly vulnerable groups who are already vulnerable, for example. So making sure that we're looking at vulnerability from everybody's perspectives, looking through a deeper lens at the levels and types of change. So this includes looking at a system's structural dimensions, and then going down even deeper to the level of mindsets, to the level of narratives. So in a food system, is the goal of the food system really about food security? Is it changing to food system nutrition? And that's something that might, be categorized as a food system narrative. Mindsets, power dynamics, how do different actors relate between themselves? How connected are they? That's one part of it, but who holds what kind of power in that dynamic? So that's another example of the types of things that we consider in a systemic approach. Another one here is about building capacity. And I think, again, we've talked about that in previous presentations, but capacity includes things like anticipatory capacity or capacity to learn and iterate. And, that's all about adaptive learning. A big theme here is collaboration and participatory approaches. Again, just highlighting the point that any examination of vulnerability, shocks, and resilience and responses of adaptation have to look at perspectives from everybody in the system, including the most vulnerable. And therefore, any diagnosis should be participatory. Any kind of design of responses ideally should be participatory. And all of this normally entails a very collaborative approach. And that includes even in the context of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So another So this is really the elements of what does it mean to take a systemic approach to resilience. And just moving to the next slide, I think what I wanted to highlight today is that it's really important, as I was saying earlier, to look at participatory approaches and collaboration for resilience. An important aspect of both building resilience and measuring it is taking an approach that is collaborative, that is participative. And this means making sure that we're working with others, we're taking into account the range of actors in the system, their perspectives around if things are changing, what is changing, how how are these dynamics changing, and both in terms of their observations and experiences in the system. For example, understanding very context-specific vulnerabilities or nuance. And collaboration, as I said, is also necessary to design the responses, to implement them, and then to learn together and learn more widely from what's happening. So that's really, I'm going to move to a couple of tools and approaches that we use, but I do want to underscore that any application of any sort of tool ideally should be done in a very participatory and collaborative manner. It's not meant to be sort of top-down test research only. What are those tools? I'll just talk through a couple of examples of how can you sort of use different approaches for systems diagnosis very collaboratively. So these are tools, a couple of examples of tools that can be used to see what is changing in a system. In our case, the food and agriculture system. And importantly, applying any such tool to diagnose systems change, you must work with system actors and surface their perspectives and include that here. So I'll deep dive a little bit into the first one, which is called the X curve. And I'll just stay here for a little longer, maybe in the next slide. So this tool called the X curve is, sorry, if you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So one way to look at how a system is changing, and that's really the state of transition of the system, is through this tool. It's called the X curve. Now, this framework helps to identify the state of momentum in both what might be pointing towards a new desired system and also what might be breaking down in the current system. So let's say that this is in the context of the agriculture system. What might be, today pointing us towards a more climate resilient, just and regenerative agriculture system, and what might be breaking down in the current agriculture system. And we can map these dynamics onto this tool to really see what are the forces of change, and what's kind of shifting the balance. So as an example, at Forum, we applied this approach to look at the state of transition of the agriculture system in one particular region in India. And we took a collaborative approach. We spoke with multiple actors working in that geography on the agriculture transition, and that included people from across civil society, technical extension services, representatives, think tanks, philanthropic funders, social enterprises, and of course, farmer representative organizations. And we convened diverse actors across the system to build a shared understanding of the key levels of change to accelerate the transition towards that shared vision. And that vision was really about climate resilient, regenerative agriculture systems. Now applying the X curve and how we used it, the main strength of this as a framework is that it can support groups of people to develop a shared understanding of the dynamics of transitions in the making. And this really helps them reflect on their own roles, their own potential influence, and even the needed capacities for desired transitions. So using a transition lens allowed us to take a step back and look at the areas of momentum and stuckness even across diverse focus areas and present a comprehensive picture of what really is changing. And using this and convening people and having the dialogues with them also created a space for everyone to learn from the diversity of transition roadmaps. So, different types of organizations, different types of collaborations had different aims and objectives, all within the overall vision of more climate resilient, regenerative agriculture system. But everybody was coming at it from different perspectives. And they did find it useful to just situate themselves, look at the zoomed out overall picture and see where is their role and influence, what are others doing, what might be helping, what might be barriers. And through using this, we were able to sort of all together gain a clearer understanding of what's changing and also test our assumptions around what is needed to support the transition and also what might be holding things back. So, for example, we were able to identify and test ideas for critical shifts that are needed to propel the transition in a more just and regenerative direction. And we looked at different areas for the shifts. So this might be, shifts needed in the institutional landscape, narrative shifts. And the example that, we heard a lot when we were speaking with people was about not just looking at food security, but also looking at nutrition security in a climate changed context. Shifts in the context of policy orientation, example, moving to a more non-siloed approach between different actors and even between different government departments to tackle climate change, or the need for a more decentralized execution of existing policies. Those were some examples that came up. Other parameters include exploring ideas for scaling successful experiments to mainstream certain agroecological practices. Changes were identified that were needed in the funding and finance landscape for more long-term support for farmers to transition. So this included things like, big picture realigning subsidies and incentives. Also, another parameter was the value chains and the need to kind of look also to building and supporting the needs, not only across the value chain from the production to the consumer, but even from a place-based perspective. So supporting needs for local production, local value addition, and local consumption, looking at those ecosystems as well. Another example was governance, and for example, the need for more agency to be given to local governance. So this basically helped identify certain critical shifts, and I'm just giving you a few examples of what types of critical shifts emerged. Also, applying this tool, we kind of worked to co-build principles around how actors need to work. So, for example, taking a landscape approach, or making sure that whatever we do is farmer-centric, and we don't want to impose additional risk or burden for the most vulnerable. Those were a couple of different examples of the principles that different actors came up with towards shaping the transition. So this is just a snapshot of how, one of these tools really helped people have this kind of dialogue. It gave a bit of structure. A lot of the insights and perspectives were held and shared previously, but people did find that using a more collaborative approach and this kind of a structure did help, sort of see each other better and see their own roles better and give a structure to what really needs to be done. So that's one example of how we applied a collaborative approach and looked at what's changing in a system. There's another tool on the next slide. This is from another piece of work that we've done, I think one slide before this, Shuchi, which is the MLP. Thank you. So this is called the multi-level perspective, and this is a systems change framework that can be used to look at different influences that could lead to or be worked with to catalyze, transformative change. So there are three levels that we really look at over here. One is the landscape, and that's basically the big picture, the operating context, the long-term mega trends and social values, that we hold. The middle level is called the regime, which is the mainstream, the business as usual, the day-to-day, operating context. And then there is the niche, and this is a more exceptional, the margins of the mainstream. So what is emerging in the social and technical innovation space, for example. And seeing all of this together and placing these forces and changes on a map like this shows how perhaps changes in the landscape can put pressure on the current operating context, which is the regime level. And that might lead to an opportunity for things that are right now bubbling in the niche to really play a more disruptive role and maybe help them scale up as well and reshape that mainstream. So this is another example from some of our work, and how these different forces and dynamics were kind of mapped to this tool to see what is changing, what is really bubbling up in the niche, and what can really, and all of this analysis is being used actually to kind of convene different actors and see who plays what roles in maybe expanding the niche or maybe acting on changing the regime at play today. So very high level, but this is just a quick kind of snapshot of another way of looking at system dynamics and change. The third example for working collaboratively is for resilience measurement. So this tool is called the 6 conditions of systems change. And it sort of very clearly and very briefly lays out the different levels at which change can happen. So how do we translate this tool into something that can be contributing to resilience measurement? So one step could be that we build a theory of change that takes into account these different types of change and different levels of change. And then we measure for what's changing against each of these. So in the theory of change, we might map out, statements for each of the levels that you're seeing here. And the levels that you're seeing here talk about, the more structural parts of a system, like policies or resource flows, whether they are information flows or funding flows, to the more deeper kind of root causes behind, why a system is the way it is. And that includes things like mental models or value systems and beliefs. And you really kind of use this tool to articulate all of that and give a structure of it. So some examples are on this slide, which is, how might you translate this into a theory of change? If your goal, for example, is enhanced climate resilience and well-being, then at the outcome level of your theory of change, you might talk about community power. And I'm thinking of this from a very local food system perspective. So let's say things like community power and agency in decision-making, or their capacity in adaptive learning, or their increased capabilities to build resilience. And then because it's a theory of change approach, ultimately all of this is mapping, how are we as change actors contributing towards that change? And therefore at a more activity, level of the theory of change, we might talk about what resilience and vulnerability needs have been identified. So yeah, I think speaking to something that Chris had said earlier, some of the things that we would measure for are, of course, the resilience capacities, as you're seeing here, things like adaptive learning, for example, and to know if a system is actually more resilient depends a lot on the local perspectives per se. So do people actually feel more resilient? Are they experiencing, a better ability to thrive or more well-being? So we do also need to place this in the larger context of what is changing in the system, and that's where this kind of a tool comes in. So I know that I've run through a few different types of tools, and I've approached this from a very big picture lens of looking at systems and what's changing, and how do we kind of stretch that concept of resilience to more transformational adaptation. So this was just a few examples of some of our work, but I'll stop now, and do let me know if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Yamini. This was great. I think really the transition from where we started with Chris's presentation of very specific examples and very robust evidence around that to MSRI, which started sort of teasing out the complexities and then the big picture lens that you brought in. Before I get into questions for all three of you, I think, Yamini, I have one question for you, where I was just wondering if you have any, and I'm sure you've come across other tools which are which are more traditional, if I may say so, in terms of, in terms of the rigor and robustness that they have versus systems tools which are process based, but often kind of question around what's the rigor, where's the rigor, where's the robustness, and if there's any unpacking of the balance between the two that you can kind of share with us. And I know it's not an either or, it's always an and, but just understanding from you if there's any there's any thoughts on that from your side.
Yeah, no, totally acknowledging that this is a much, big picture kind of process driven approach. And the magic really is the process more than even the output sometimes from the process. And that's a very big departure from rigor and, what is your final analysis telling you in most tools. But the benefit is kind of creating that space for people to surface what is normally not talked about, to go a little deeper. So things like narratives and worldviews and beliefs is something that we have at the back of our minds, and it is a root cause for many of the things that are happening in a system, but we don't have a structured way to consider it. So the process of of going through a collaborative approach to discuss that is really where these kinds of tools hold the most power. I won't discount the outputs, obviously. Having that map is also very useful. Just as an anecdote, I think one of the projects that I was talking about, where we were looking at a state of transition, it was a very, very active space. And there were lots of actors doing a lot already on the ground, doing very rigorous, data mapping, including the evidence for the transition. Does natural farming work, for example? What's the evidence? So very rigorous stuff happening on the ground. And at one point, I think we were also questioning and wondering how much of a systems mapping is really needed when people are already doing so much. What we found at the end of the process, however, and that's what I was trying to highlight, is that people did they are sort of deep into their own rigorous processes, but then you don't see how is that often laddering up or adding to what somebody else is doing, or what can we learn from that somebody else. And that process of coming together and doing this diagnosis together and seeing your space and seeing what others are doing, that was really the value of this kind of an approach.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. I know we have 4 minutes, but I wanted to take that time to kind of see if there are any questions from the audience. I'll wait for a second or two and then maybe um, have one question each from all three of you very quickly. One answer each for a common question. Well, I don't see any questions from the audience, no burning questions, but I think the one thing that I took away from all three of your presentations was the whole transition of, and probably the tension between the idea of individual resilience or household level resilience, and the tension with systemic resilience or systems level resilience. And that's what I took from all of your presentations, where each of you were kind of talking about food system resilience in that pushing the envelope almost on that aspect of that tension between the two. So just very quickly, starting with Chris, I guess, your thoughts on this balance, and where are we as a group thinking about it, and from your perspective, of course, from your vantage point, each of you, if you could just highlight where we are at with this balance between the individual and the system, and resilience of both.
Yeah, thanks, Suchi. It's actually a very, very interesting and intriguing question which you raised. So I'm happy you did. I don't think we have at the present time a very clear understanding. What I think is much more important is to be aware of that kind of not necessarily intuitive observation that the resilience of the system does not necessarily mean the resilience of the actors of the system. And as I was pointing out with the experience of the COVID, that in fact the resilience of some part of the system might be built at the detriment of the resilience of individuals. And that speaks to very much to what, some of the issues of power that Yamini was mentioning. We are really at the beginning of that journey. I think there's a parallel with what happened 15 years ago when we started talking about the resilience of household. But as I was pointing in my very short introduction, we have scaling up the complexity of the question, and we still have to dive deeper into. The point very shortly is, yes, to be aware of and to walk away from the simplistic and naive perception that everything is perfect and that building the resilience of everyone will be the solution. As I said, you may be building the resilience of a few at the detriment of a lot. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kazi, same question.
So I think with the understanding of the actors, the complexity is important, but we also have to make it like in how localization and how we can co-develop with the community. Something we have tried, but like the scale up of the thing is something is still gray area. So that's what I have to say.
Great, thank you so much. That's very valuable introspection almost. Thank you. Yamini, what about you? This tension between the individual and systemic resilience.
Yeah, I think it's just also similar to what Chris was saying. I feel like this is a situation where the whole is not just the sum of its parts, and it's not like one or the other. You have to look at, the smaller, individual household level resilience for sure, of course. But just because resilience of a household or particular group is increasing doesn't mean that the system is doing better, and that's where the systemic systems change approach comes in, which is mapping out those other dynamics and those unanticipated consequences. So how do you make sure that resilience of one is not at the cost of some valuable attribute in another part of the system? So I feel like both are very important, but how do you see it together? It's not just by adding up individual resilience equals the whole system is the sum of that. There is more in the story of the system apart from looking at that individual resilience.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we are at time. So I shall take the liberty to thank the audience, the virtual audience, and the organizers and IDE for inviting all of us here. Thank you so much for listening to us for this 1.5 hours. And finally, of course, the speakers for such wealth of information, brilliant presentations, and really unpacking this question. It's often a sticky question of food system resilience from wherever we are at. So thank you so much for unpacking that question. All right, thank you so much, and bye bye. Have a great lunch after this, I think. Bye.